Good evening. Welcome. This is American Diplomacy at Risk, a program that is designed to tell Americans why diplomacy is important and a little bit about what it is, why it isn't as boring as you might think it is. And as we go into the second section of diplomacy and security, that probably will get us into some subjects that are not perhaps the way you imagine diplomacy. By the way, diplomats really suck on movies. I've never seen a diplomat portrayed in a way that I either recognized or wanted to be. But tonight we're going to give you a little bit more reality. I've got Ambassador Deborah McCarthy with me this evening, who has had a lot of experience in a number of frontline places. But before we get into this, Deborah, could you talk a little bit about how you spent your career?
First of all, I was a banker and I became a diplomat, so that's a huge switch. And after that, weaved in and out between
You've
different
never seen much money since. Yeah.
No, I made far less money, but that's okay. It was an exciting ride. Spent a lot of time in Latin America and in Europe. Between the two, did a lot of economic negotiations, did a lot of work on counterterrorism, counter-drug, and then finished up as ambassador to Lithuania, and was most exciting after the invasion of Ukraine by Russia.
Well, let's go right into there, because there you are, you're in Lithuania, Russia has moved into the Ukraine, and all of a sudden you got Europeans wondering what NATO is worth, what our policies are. This isn't something you get a response to just in the military, in diplomacy. So, how did this shake out from your perspective?
When Russia went rolling into Crimea and then into eastern Ukraine, you could feel a shiver go through the Baltics and parts of Eastern Europe. For those in command, both politically and on the military side, had watched the last tanks roll out and never thought it would happen again, though we had the experience in Georgia. So therefore we had to be co-joined with our military colleagues in the next steps. They asked for more presence of US troops. We had to negotiate.
They, the Lithuanians.
The Lithuanians, and all through the arc of the East. And we had to negotiate that and set up not only training, but also negotiate the basis in which it'd be a bigger US presence. And don't forget, we had cut back our presence in Europe. So we had to roll that forward in a new direction. So working very closely with our military colleagues, we prepared the stage for a different setup in Europe.
So you're basically doing both civilian negotiations about a framework, military negotiations about operational matters, and the two have to really match up.
But it also grew because we moved into the cyber world, cyberspace being our new frontier. We moved into the world of information warfare, for that was taking place. So it also took us in different directions. And again, it was not just the civilian diplomatic side, but also our military colleagues that had to work on these
challenges. Come back to the cyber piece for a minute. What went on there? What's diplomacy's role in countering cyber warfare?
In my view, cyberspace is the new frontier. And as diplomats, we don't focus on the technical side, but we're negotiating with governments and working with the private sector on new rules of the game. We're building a cyber infrastructure in the US. Other countries are building their cyber infrastructures to protect themselves. But how do we work together? So slowly but surely across the globe, we're working with different countries on the rules in case something bad happens. And we come to the rescue of each other on occasion.
And cyber warfare and information, whether you call it information warfare, we used to be more honest, we used to call it propaganda. But these things merge. I mean, there's not clear dividing lines. So how much, particularly as Russia has gotten into this business in Europe, how much were you engaged as a diplomat on dealing with Russian information warfare?
Well, people don't know that a lot of diplomats are sort of closet journalists. Some actually come from a journalism background. But in tackling this whole new issue, we have the following. It's not propaganda anymore where people are trying, or a country is trying to convince us of their point of view. It's disinformation and information warfare. So we doubt what we see, what we read. So as the US tries to get its messages out, they're being twisted. As we're receiving messages, they're being twisted. So we doubt sources. And that is creating a whole new space in our diplomacy, which is actually really exciting.
At least if we get it right. Yeah.
We
Well,
will
it
get it
will be
right.
exciting
We
if we
are
get it
getting
wrong
it right.
too. Good. We've just got a minute or two left, but one thing we haven't talked about is why should we be doing what we're doing in the Baltics in terms of increasing the military presence, reassuring the governments?
People often ask why we have troops in Europe. Why today? I mean, in this century. And we don't have that many, but we leverage a lot. Out of a few exercises and out of a presence in certain parts of Europe, we get contributions to our efforts in Afghanistan, contributions in Iraq, yes votes at the UN with us, votes in other fora, and they go along with us in our other causes around the world. So it's a great bang for the buck. And that's why we do things there.
And Europe, I mean, the security of Western Europe is pretty integrally tied to America. It's a little hard to imagine Europe falling apart and us doing well.
Well, they pretty much take care of themselves.
Yeah.
But again, we work with them because we can't forget, we've been at war in other places for so long. We were not used to deploying in Europe. And we had to relearn some things as hybrid warfare was taking place next door. So that's why we partner with the Europeans. It helps us.
So diplomacy remains a central piece of this. Thank you
Absolutely.
for coming by to talk about it and help
Thank you.
people understand, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you.
I've got Admiral Mike Smith with me. He's been part of this world as well, from the Navy, from the military side, from everything from senior staff billets to running a carrier task group. And we were talking just before the program about how we have been assigning over the years, we've been assigning State Department officers to military commands for a particular role that I don't think many people know about.
Yeah, I think, like we were discussing earlier, the political advisor is being assigned usually to a combatant commander. So we've taken the globe and we divide them in the military into regions. So everyone knows about the Central Command commander. General Mattis was that at one point. I happened to serve for about 2.5 years with the Pacific Command commander. And he had working for him an advisor that was active duty State Department and who had just left as the #2 guy at the embassy in Beijing. So when you wanted to talk about China and understand what was going on, where my boss had been the Pacific Fleet Commander, he had been the 7th Fleet Commander out in Japan, he had a very good understanding of Japan when it came to the military capabilities. The insight that that political advisor provided was invaluable when it came to all the other things that are going on in China. You know, I remember we went to the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. So this is the big discussion between our two governments. And we walk into the main room and it's this giant table. You know, it had to have been, I don't know, half a football field long, it seemed like. But when you sat down, my boss sat down, his counterpart was a single 1-star Navy admiral. And then you looked at everybody else that was doing trade and economics and it was just, the whole table was filled with this array of things. That's what's going on. That's the real world. So where my boss understands China from the perspective of that small slice of the military, that advisor is able to tell them about all the other things that are going on. And now that you're cutting the budget, they're not filling those billets. And that's
No, it's crazy if you don't have it. We have had practice at doing this without political advice. Actually, in the Pacific, when Admiral Dewey was getting ready to sail for Manila during the Spanish-American War, so we're talking 1898, he actually held the fleet for an extra, I think, 2 days to let the consul from Manila, who'd been there observing Spanish positions and politics, get to the fleet to give him some advice. I hope we don't get to the position where if we don't fill the billets, you've got to keep the fleet at anchor waiting for somebody to show up.
You know, I think today you're already experiencing that. You know, that, and the problem is you don't even know you're missing that. Because there's no way that had you not worked with that one individual who had that breadth of experience in China, you wouldn't even know you were missing that.
Yeah. Until you do something that steps on Chinese toes, gets you a massive reaction, screws up an operation because you didn't know about the politics.
Absolutely.
Then you're gonna miss it. Well, I think that is, you know, that in a microcosm is how we work together, and also how we both know, we the civilians, we the military, that we need each other. I don't know why it is so hard when you've got the two communities that do the job saying, as you just did, that we need this, and yet we've got a nation that wonders if it's really true that we need it, and an administration that doesn't want to fund it. Well, there we are. You know, and it gets us back to General Mattis. What was that famous quote that everybody loves about General Mattis? If you don't fund diplomacy, you got to buy me more bullets.
Absolutely.
But you may not know all that you need to know about where to shoot them.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Mike, thank you. I think that's a great lesson for us.
All right, well, thanks for having me.
Thank you. Ed, welcome to the program. This is Ambassador Ed Marks, for those of you who are watching, an old friend of mine, and one who's had a very distinguished career. Ed, can you do the really brief outline of how you spent 30 or 40 years in the Foreign Service?
Thank you, Ron. It's a pleasure to be here. Actually, I think it's been a fairly typical career for people of my generation. I spent a lot of time in Africa at the beginning, then did some itinerant roving around back and forth to Europe and to Asia, and then ended up near the end concentrating more than anything else on counterterrorism problems. And I did that in the Department of State and a bit overseas, and then of course during some time up at the United Nations. So it was a fairly classic career, quite itinerant, the career of a professional foreigner.
Thank you very much. Now, we'll go on to this, ask you some questions here. Ed, we were talking before the show, and you were mentioning that one of the most compelling examples we've got of diplomacy working with the military about security is the ongoing repulse of the Islamic State. Why don't you pick up on that?
It's practically destroyed. It has been eliminated over a process of combat against it the last 3 years, an attack on it that was conducted by a coalition of countries. And what a coalition. The United States, our Western European friends, Turkey, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Yemen. These are a bunch of people and countries that have different views on many things and are in fact competitors in many areas. But on this subject, in which they all agreed, the United States led the formation by diplomatic discussion and negotiation of a coalition which has succeeded in essentially defeating the attempt to establish an Islamic State in the Middle East.
At least it's defeated the territorial aspect of it. As we go into a major problem now of it going underground, we're going to need diplomacy even more.
Agreed.
One of the things we do, civilians do, military does, military trains all the time. And you've been involved in helping them sort of enact the civilian component. Why do you do that? Why do they want it? And why aren't they they're active, they're the people that are really going to do it. Why haven't they got active duty State Department people doing this?
Well, the military want what they call role players, civilian role players in their exercise, because they wish their exercises to be as factual and as accurate as possible. As they say, they train in order to be able to fight. But they realize, and they make a point, that all military activities nowadays in the modern world have a important political context. So instead of having some conscripted major to play an American ambassador or a political officer, They prefer to get someone who's actually done the job and can bring into the game that perspective, that attitude, those views.
Yeah, but when you come, you bring all those attitudes. But then you go back to your life as a retired diplomat. Wouldn't it be more useful to have an active duty state person there with no denigration of what you bring to the exercise?
Absolutely right. But state doesn't seem to be able to find sufficient officers. It doesn't have the additional staff. It doesn't even have what the military call a training float. It doesn't have extra people to use in these facilities.
And that's a really important point, and I think it's a point people don't understand. It goes to how small the State Department is. It's now just a little over 8,000 people. It's being drawn down. It went up a little bit when it didn't have enough people for Iraq and Afghanistan, and as soon as we got up, now we've decided to draw it down. So there you are. The military's training to get better. They've got retired diplomats helping them, but state's not able to train to get any better at working with the military because they can't find a body. And you've taken that subject up with state, I know.
But the military, it is interesting. The military keep asking for state representatives. It's the military who want it, who keep asking for it and can't get it.
So the military knows they need it. They ask for it. State would like to give it, but has no bodies. And now we're going to have fewer people with less money to do less the next time the military asks. Well, that's why we say diplomacy is at risk. Well, welcome to American Diplomacy at Risk. We're now moving into the second session of this program. We want to talk about security, how diplomacy is part of American security. And that may not be an idea that really occurred to you automatically when you thought about diplomacy. Let me start with one perhaps somewhat like extreme example. When I was in Iraq, we were getting ready to fight a battle in Fallujah. The town was enemy-occupied, center of torture, of corruption, of hijacked trucks, and we really didn't think we could have an election and have an occupied town. And the Prime Minister of Iraq, Mr. Alawi, had agreed that we had to do this, but he was very nervous about it. The whole run-up to the battle was joint planning. It was, how are we going to handle the civilians who are needing humanitarian assistance? When are we going to give control back to the Iraqi government after the army? I worked extremely closely with the military. And the last act of this, we needed to get started. We were coming up on major religious holidays, and Alawi still hadn't quite given the go-ahead. So the Corps commander and I flew down to Jordan, to Amman, where Alawi was coming back from a trip. We met him, we got on a C-130 aircraft together, 3 microphones and headsets to talk over the plane noise. We jointly briefed him on the military and civilian aspects, political aspects of the campaign plan, and we got the go-ahead to start the battle in the middle of the night when we landed in Baghdad. Now that's about as close as you can get on civil-military cooperation, but it goes on all the time, and you don't necessarily have to have a war. Deborah, let me welcome back, and let me also ask you, you've been in the middle of NATO events, you've been in Latin America. What would stand out to you as an example of the civil military security issues?
Walking in with a phalanx in terms of a team to negotiate, in one case it was to negotiate a new oil pipeline for Suda Bay. 8 years in the making, and when we walked in, that team composed of all elements of the government and said, we need it now and we need to negotiate it as soon as possible. When they saw how serious we were, and not only that, but the formidable team that we had, we knew we were going to get it soon, and it took us less than 3 months.
And that was military and civilian in the team?
Absolutely, yes.
Great. Admiral, Mike,
Ambassador.
welcome back.
Thank you.
I'd like to pass back to you for a second, and also looking at, as you look back on things you've done in your career, what stands out to you as an example of this putting together of the military, the civilians, and bringing this stuff together?
I I think you both gave great examples of the classic interaction at the highest level that really, moves forward our national interests. But I think one of the best examples I saw, and this is at the very lowest level, but it was just so encouraging when we, both in Iraq and Afghanistan, when I would fly in with my boss and we would go and talk to the folks that were doing the provisional reconstruction teams, the PRTs. This is a group of interagency folks, usually led by a colonel or perhaps a Navy captain, but you had all ranks involved on the military side, and you had the whole interagency there. You had folks from USAID, you had agriculture people, you had State Department people, and they were all working together on a day-to-day basis to try and improve the lives of that village they happened to be assigned, or that area they happened to be assigned. And it's not a discussion of how successful they were or what happened in that region. It was the experiences. To me, I always walked away thinking, that young officer, the Army captain or the Navy lieutenant that happened to be part of that, he or she is going to walk away, and for the rest of their career, they're going to understand how you can do it right. Yeah. And they're going to take that with them wherever they go. And to me, that was just a phenomenal example and very positive example to me of how we can do it right at all levels, really.
It was a great example. We had, I think we had 25 of them when I left, or 24 when I left Afghanistan. And we also had State Department aid people out in the NATO PRTs that run by other countries. But it was also an interesting example of what happens when you don't fund these things properly. By the time you were there, we'd gotten the funding and the manpower had been plussed up. When I was there, we had so few people that if somebody got sick on the state side, so few civilians, when somebody got sick on the state side and had to be medevaced, we'd have a 2-month gap before we could refill the billet.
The funding, that's my biggest concern, is this whole funding issue. Because what's the first thing that's going to go away if you cut dramatically the State Department budget? It's the folks that are trying to capture all those lessons learned. So everything we just learned working so closely together in Iraq and Afghanistan, we're going to lose that because you just won't have the funding and to put the people there to capture that, to be able to train the next generation of diplomats. And when we need it again, we're going to have to start all over, and we're going to do exactly what you just experienced. We're not going to have the right manning, we're not going to have the right number of people, funding, and it's going to take us years to capture that, all because we're dramatically reducing a budget and we're not doing what's important.
And squeezing the budget means we can't have the bases, which are embassies. They'll be on a shoestring. Squeezing the budget means the negotiating teams will be small. Squeezing the budget means we can't help others for our own interests and humanitarian things. And basically, we cannot do our diplomacy.
So there you have it in a nutshell. We know how to work together. We've done it. We do it well. But you can't do it without the people. You can't do it without the training.
Right.
And that's why diplomacy is part of security, and diplomacy is at risk. This has been a discussion of American diplomacy at risk with a particular focus on security. And you've heard us talk now with Admiral Smith about the need to have American diplomats posted with our military for the critical kind of advice, because what they focus on is different, but the two come together. You've heard Ambassador McCarthy talking about the issue of how we negotiate together. You even heard a little bit from me about how we got ready to have a battle together. Well, let me just take a minute to draw a few points out of this. First and foremost, you have the repeated testimony of generals, admirals, ambassadors over and over again that this working together is essential, that the military tool doesn't function as well by itself, and that you can win battles, but to settle wars, you got to have the whole thing. Secondly, you've heard that it's not just about battles, it's about how you negotiate. It's about peace, it's about positioning and what you do and getting your forces in and out of places. In other words, This is not just one thing or something you can send somebody out for suddenly when you have a mission. This is something that goes on like diplomacy, like the deployment of our military forces, every day, every night, all around the world. And that's why you need to keep an adequate diplomacy to work with our first-class military. This has been American Diplomacy at Risk, a focus on security. Thank you for joining us.